Hi, I want to tell you a little bit about dyslexia, specifically surface dyslexia. I'm dyslexic. I'm not entirely positive what kind of dyslexia I have, but I know that I am dyslexic, so I'm a little bit well versed in this area. So, before I talk to you about dyslexia in general, I want to give you some of the strengths because people very often only talk about the negatives of dyslexia. So, some of the strengths in dyslexia is that we are really good at reasoning, critical thinking, concept formation, problem solving, vocabulary, listening comprehension, and communication. One of the reasons why I know that I'm really good at listening is because I can't read very well. So I have to listen as well as possible, especially in a school setting. So for causation, there's no real found cause yet. There's no damages or malformation to the brain. There's just a little bit of a miscommunication with it. There are some possible causes. There could have been trauma during peri, post, or prenatal. There could be a genetic factor to it, which is most likely where mine came from. My father is dyslexic. Um, Also, it could have been biochemical, which is anything like foods, stuff like that. And also environmental, if people are malnourished, if they're in a weird situation where they're not being taken care of, all that kind of stuff that can affect your brain. So, for characteristics for people with dyslexia, one of the main reasons why I chose this picture is because I personally, from all the research I've done, feel like this is not a very good representation of dyslexia. Your letters don't really get jumbled up as much as you can't really follow along as well. Um, from some of the research that I did, I found that with surface dyslexia specifically, you have vocal reactions delayed, increased eye movement, which is when people's eyes just move back and forth, which is honestly where a lot of the letters getting jumbled up comes from in the kind of misconception, in my opinion. So you'll go back and forth and you assume that your letters get jumbled up, but really it's just because you're jumping around a lot. Letter recognition, which I do have an issue with, and that's confusing your B's and your D's and your G's and your J's. Deficit in scanning, which also I have an issue with, so that's just trying to flow through a page quickly. You can't scan as well. Fixation, and that's just trying to figure out a word for too long. If there's a big word that you've never seen before, or if it's a word you have seen before and for some reason your brain just isn't computing it, it's really hard to figure that out, and you will not get off of that word until you know it. And also additional emotional behaviors, especially in young children. They will get frustrated in the classroom, outside of the classroom, so on, because they feel like they're falling behind, they don't understand what's going on, and they get upset about it. So, some of the statistics, dyslexia actually is not in a category of its own. It falls under section 140130B, and it's in category SLD, which is specific learning disabilities. So it falls with a couple of other learning disabilities. And 4.99% of students age 6 to 21 in PA were reported in IDEA, and zero students ages 3 to 5 in PA were reported in IDEA from 2019 to 2020. My assumption for this is because it's really hard to find dyslexia for such young children because it's kind of difficult to see that they have a reading disability at such a young age. So placement and LRE, which is least restrictive environment, it's definitely best to keep them in the classroom. So you just have to make sure that they have the services that they need. As long as a student can be served with an IEP in the classroom and further evaluations are done, there's no reason why they shouldn't be kept in the classroom. And on their team, they should have parents, teachers, counselors, and school psychologists. There should always be backup. There should always be people advocating for them. And especially with that emotional gap and barrier that these students are going to have, even if you have an IEP and even if you have teachers trying to work with you, there can be times where they still get frustrated because it is hard no matter how hard you're trying. You still need somebody in your back pocket telling you it's okay and having a counselor kind of walking you through those extra steps. Some educational strategies that I really liked. Um, so, scaffolding, providing support for students. So, you can't necessarily expect that students will know what you need them to do or that they're ready for it. Just because they're in fifth grade doesn't mean that they're going to be able to read instructions exactly how you need them to. So, if you hand them a booklet and say, read this, do exactly what you need to do, they're not going to be able to do it every time, especially if it's a difficult level of instruction. And then direct instruction, ensure that students understand what they're supposed to do instead of just giving them instruction on paper, and walk them through each step. So if you give them that opportunity of explaining it, making sure they understand it, breaking it down, and then giving them the opportunity to do it on their own, they're going to be a lot more likely to succeed in that situation. So accommodations and modifications. You can clarify or simplify written instructions. Like I previously said, you can't just assume that they're always going to understand all of the written instructions. So if you have a lot of instruction, give them a simpler version of it, maybe break it down for them or explain it to them completely instead of just giving them those written instructions. Present a small amount of work. If you have a booklet that you're expecting the students to do, break it into pieces for them, because a lot of times students with surface dyslexia will be able to do it, but they need it broken into pieces instead of just all jumbled up, and it won't be as intimidating to them. Highlight important information similar to presenting smaller amounts of work. They still will be able to go over everything, but it's a lot easier if you highlight what you really, really need them to know. And then develop reading guides and flashcards. So if they're reading something, especially with surface dyslexia, students have a hard time picking out what they need to remember. So they may be able to read it, but they won't be able to pinpoint the who, what, where, when, why situation that we need. So if you develop a reading guide for students that they can use while they're reading, then they'll be able to write that down as they're going over everything. Similar to flashcards, a lot of students with surface dyslexia have a really hard time with understanding vocabulary and understanding those new words, which will add into the fixation later on while they're reading, maybe 3 years down the line. So if you give them flashcards to help them understand words a little bit better, then they'll be able to succeed a little more. And then here's all my citations. Just as an ending point, I would also like to say that I have heard a lot of times a lot of negative things, like I said, about dyslexia, but one positive thing that I really like about it is that a lot of students who have dyslexia are actually perfectionists, and they end up doing really well in school once they figure out what they need to do. So that's why it's so important that you do those accommodations and modifications for them. If you figure out how to help that student and you figure out how to get them to succeed in school, they will love education and they'll do everything they possibly can to succeed. Thank you.